You're listening to the Birth Matters Podcast, episode 102.
It was just such a relief. Like the whole process was such a relief. They were very respectful of my birth preferences. It was really funny. Like when I was pushing, they were just very calmly, the midwives was like handing out my birth preferences. Oh, she wants this. She doesn't want this. I was like, baby's not even out yet. Can you just focus on me? But they were very respectful of that. So I appreciated it.
Hey there, and welcome to the Birth Matters Show. I'm your host, Lisa Graves-Taylor, founder of Birth Matters NYC and director of East River Doula Collective. I'm a childbirth educator, birth doula, and lactation counselor, and have been passionately supporting growing families since 2009. This show is here to lessen your overwhelm on the journey into parenthood by equipping and encouraging you with current, best evidence info and soulful interviews with parents and birth pros. Please keep in mind, the information on this show is not intended as medical advice or to diagnose or treat any medical conditions. Here's a bit about today's story. Bettina prides herself on being a thorough researcher. She carries that into pregnancy and interviews 6 doulas before choosing one, switches from an OB to midwifery care when she doesn't feel aligned, gets prenatal breastfeeding support due to having inverted nipples, and more. At the end of pregnancy, talk of induction arises due to concerns of fetal growth restriction due to baby measuring small. Knowing that she and her partner are healthy but fairly petite people, she trusts her baby is healthy, advocates for more time, even signing an AMA or against medical advice form to not be induced at 39 weeks. Meanwhile, she tries all the natural induction techniques. Her proactive measures pay off and help her have a respectful, well-supported, unmedicated hospital birth. Bettina also shares some about the breastfeeding challenges she faced and the expert support she received from both lactation consultants and a chiropractor who specializes in the Webster technique for newborns. Before we hear from Bettina, I just wanted to share a few upcoming events for expectant parents. The first one is East River Doula Collective's next free virtual Meet the Doulas event. It's on Saturday, July 22nd at 5 p.m. on Zoom. Visit eastriverdoulas.nyc for the RSVP link. We'd love to see you there. Then, about a week and a half after Meet the Doulas, I'll be teaching the next round of Evidence-Based Birth's Savvy Birth 101 workshop on Wednesday, August 2nd at 7 p.m. on Zoom. The Savvy Birth 101 virtual class was developed by Evidence-Based Birth to give you the inside scoop on how to form the ultimate birth team. It's an excellent class to take earlier in pregnancy and before you take a more comprehensive childbirth class, and it only takes about an hour of your time. To register for Meet the Doulas or Savvy Birth 101, or both, visit birthmattersnyc.com, and the dates and registration links are on the banner up at the top of the page. We have these approximately every 6 weeks, so if you're listening to this after the fact, you'll see the most current dates there. Please also remember that our Doula Collective offers lots of other wonderful classes and services such as baby wearing classes, sleep consults, placenta encapsulation, postpartum meals, and more. Visit our collective's website at eastriverdoulas.nyc. And finally, Birth Matters birth classes have been booking up earlier than ever lately, so please be sure to grab your spot on the early side if you want to take group birth classes in Astoria with me. We also offer private classes and have an online Netflix-style on-demand version of our all-in-one course. Find full class schedule and all other info at birthmattersnyc.com. And finally, before we jump into today's episode, we just want to do a listener shout-out. Birth Matters podcast listener April started listening and got in touch while trying to conceive. She wrote this to us about 8 months ago in the fall. I just have to say thank you for all that you are doing to help pregnant people and new parents. I've been listening to your podcast since summer 2021. I binged a lot of the early episodes while doing puzzles at my kitchen table and was very impatiently waiting for this newest season to start. I can't tell you how helpful it has been for me for so many different reasons. Then April more recently got in touch to let us know that she's now expecting and added this. As someone who has only been in New York City for 5 years, the the podcast has been such a great resource for me to learn about all the hospitals and providers in the area. And I believe that hearing so many other people's stories has really helped me plan for what I want, know where to focus my energy, and overall feel less anxious about the process. Thanks so much for your kind words, April. April recently registered for birth class with me for several months from now in September. She clearly plans ahead. I can't wait to welcome you and your partner into class in the fall, April. All right, already, let's jump into Bettina's story.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bettina. Very honored to be here. I'm an Astoria native. Been here for close to 15 years. Astoria has changed a lot since I moved here. And I gave birth about almost 3 months ago now to a beautiful baby boy, about, I would say, a couple days before my due date. And so I've been postpartum for, about 3 months. So here we are.
Well, why don't we get started with just sharing anything you'd like to share about your conception journey and or your prenatal journey and the different ways you prepared for becoming a parent?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I want to start by saying that I'm extremely grateful that from a conception point of view, there wasn't too many hiccups. We were able to do it naturally. It took a little longer than we thought, but at the end of the day, there was no real difficulty to do it naturally. And I want to really acknowledge that could be a whole other journey for lots of people. So I feel very grateful for that. And then once I was pregnant, I would say pregnancy wasn't very cool for me. Like I was not like a happy pregnant person. Not to say I was like very unhappy, but it was a difficult time mentally. And that kind of hit me completely from left field because everyone knows about postpartum depression and all of that. And I don't think I want to use the word depressed for my state of mind, but I definitely had an altered, darker state of mind throughout mainly the first trimester, I would say. And a lot of the things that I liked to do, I didn't like anymore, like eating and socializing and spending time with people. Like I just wanted to be alone. And then I was very emotional. So that was really out of the blue and not something I could have ever prepared for. Just like to be in a different mental state, I think is hard. So that was the start of it. But things do get better and things did get better. And I think by the second trimester, I was more of my usual self. Like I think similar to you, Lisa, I'm like organized. Let's like try to do as much research as possible, find out all my options, educate myself the best way possible. I read so many books. I literally combed like every corner of your website, Lisa. I know all of the
Thank you,
resources.
because I spend so much time on it all the time.
Know,
and I'm
so
like, does
thorough.
anybody ever look at all this
stuff? Like even down to the districts and the areas that you live in for what providers and what's insurance friendly. That's how I found my pelvic floor PT. Like everything was very comprehensive. Like you beat Google many times.
Yay!
So
That's
yeah,
a big win.
I was very grateful for that. And the very first thing, I think the thing that kind of triggered all of this research was we watched that documentary, The Business of Being Born. And then both my partner and I were like, oh my goodness, what are we getting ourselves into? This is what it is. Even though it's like old in terms of the stats and everything, a lot of the information is still very relevant. And I had not really thought about my provider team, I would say, before watching that documentary, like in terms of whether or not I wanted a doula, whether or not I wanted to give birth in a hospital. I didn't even think about that as an option. But after seeing that, and like, it wasn't so much, oh, for sure, I want to have a home birth. It was more like, oh, okay, I really need to look into my options and really think deeply about that. And thankfully, I was like more of myself. So I really did more research and did as much as I could, given the time I had with my job and everything. But yeah, like one of the most important steps I think I took was, I think I just Googled doulas in Astoria or something. And that's how I found you and your collective. And I signed up for I forget what it's called, but it's like speed dating with doulas on Zoom.
Meet the doulas. Yeah.
There you go. That was great. I actually like have now a really close friend through that meetup, Jenna. She was someone who was like, had the same due date, and Eshe ended up being born on her daughter's due date, which is funny.
Oh, wow.
She went to your class too, but like earlier on. And that was like the start of like, okay, this is like the beginning of us taking control of our situation, asking some questions. With Simone, when I read, I think you had this whole thing about what is the difference between a full spectrum postpartum or birth doula. And so before we even started interviewing people during that meet and greet, we knew we wanted a full spectrum because neither of us had family around. And we felt like we really wanted one person to be that kind of like full line of support. And then thinking through if we wanted like a pair doula or a single doula, like there was a lot of different questions, but I think that was the trigger of like, okay, these are the things that we want to really start thinking about. So Simone was the first step. And to this day, we still think that's one of the most important decisions and investments we made ever about this whole journey. And yeah, obviously I signed up for your class, which was great. For me, the most important thing about your class was that feeling of community. A lot of the information was good and I was able to read back on it before I gave birth. But I think just being there in the space with all these other people in similar shoes and feeling that community, I think that's one of the most valuable things I took out of your class, other than the great resources and the PowerPoint. I literally studied your PowerPoint like I was going to have an exam on it. But yeah, that was really good. And then, yeah, I had near the end of my pregnancy, I think I was reading a few more books, and in the back of my mind, I had been like, breastfeeding probably isn't going to work in the back, like far back in my mind. For some reason, I was just like, I don't think this is going to work for me. So I probably just like also just psyched myself out a little. I have inverted nipples, so I knew that. I didn't even realize that was a thing until Simone told me that. And I was like, oh, okay, that's a thing. That might make it harder. But after your class or after I read your notes, there was something about Aetna having 6 free lactation consultant sessions. I was like, oh, I may as well, right? So I did a prenatal one with Kara, who works with Annie, and she was great. And then the last 2 things I did, I think, that were helpful was I found a pelvic floor PT. For me as an athlete, I was just very much like, oh, duh. If I'm going to like train for labor, I've done PT like almost all my life because I've injured almost everything you can injure throughout my life. So PT for me is very normalized in my brain. And so I was like, oh, there's this mysterious muscle or muscles group of muscles that I've never heard about. I literally, you have a section on your website where you have like podcasts, I think. I listened to all the podcasts about like pelvic floor stuff. We had a little baby moon to Beacon. We went to Beacon, and on my way, I listened to all the podcasts, and back, I listened to all the other podcasts.
Road trips are great for that, right?
Yeah. So Lindsay, Vistal, like a few of the ones that you had listed on your website. And I was just like really fascinated. I was like, I had no idea, like diastasis recti, all of these things that were more physical, I didn't think about. And so I went through a few sessions with Spear because they took insurance. That was the only one I could find who took insurance.
Yeah.
And also an online hypnobirthing class was one of the last things I did, which I think was also really helpful because I was like, I need to like mentally prepare as well. When you prepare, I've been a runner. So like when you prepare for a race, you physically prepare and mentally prepare. So yeah, I think I did as much as I possibly can.
You sure did. I love it.
But yeah, like everything just goes the way it's supposed to go. Like regardless of how much or how little you prepare. So I think at the end of the day, the most important thing was more the process of going through it than getting all of these things or nuggets of knowledge. The process was important. And number 2, building the people around me was the most important at the end of the day. And that was what brought me or has helped me through postpartum. Just having that specific people like Simone, like Kara, Annie, like Dr. Vella as a source of support, because for us who don't have family immediately around us, I mean, now my mom's here, so it's helpful, but through the birth experience and beyond, when you're like very vulnerable, I think those are the 2 most important things that came out of all of that preparation. I don't know if I can remember everything, all the information, but yeah.
And did you go to Dr. Vella, who is a chiropractor? Did you go to him before birth or just after?
No, that was more postpartum.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, that was after we had the lip and tongue surgery. I looked on your website for all of the bodywork resources. And he was the only one that was like in Astoria. He actually didn't end up taking my insurance, but has a very reasonable fee, like very reasonable. And it was really the proximity. I think like he was like, oh, he's 2 stops away on a bus that we can hop on.
Nice.
So when you have a 3-week-old, that's really important.
Oh yeah. Really... Proximity is everything.
Yeah,
for sure. Great. So unless there's anything else you wanted to share about the prenatal journey, you can go ahead and jump into your birth story, whatever point in your pregnancy you want to talk about
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I think, like I said, pregnancy itself was a little hard in terms of, I don't think people talk as much about it, but like the prenatal blues or happens not postpartum. Not that I'm not saying postpartum depression is not real and that it's easy or anything of that nature, but pregnancy mentally can also not be all a skip in the park. But I think after that, the biggest change for me or for us was switching to the midwifery model at Metropolitan. That was really good because when we started asking the kind of questions that you had told us to ask, I had been with just a regular NYU OB, state of the art, blah, 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 like technology, all that jazz. But the OBs were a rotation. So I saw someone different every time I went in for a prenatal checkup. And they were just like dismissive and a little bit patronizing about why are you asking these questions. I think one thing that like really got to us was when she said, what are you asking about, a home birth or something? We were just like, no, we just want to know what our options are and how are things going to happen, and very simple questions. And that just really left a bad taste in our mouth, and we're just like, we have to make a change. So I went back to your website, looked up a bunch of like midwives. This is before I took your class.
And had you hired
Midwives.
Simone at this point?
No.
Okay.
It happened around the same time, I would say. We're looking for a doula and changing our whole OB versus midwife thing. Because I'm pretty sure, because I'm so thorough, we interviewed 6 doulas.
That's impressive. That's a lot of work.
Not happy about that. Yeah, I know. He said yes to every single one. Up until
like,
the last
yes,
one.
can we just move on?
Yeah. And they were all great. But then it was like Simone was the busiest too. So we had to keep pushing off our meet and greet date with her. And then when we decided on her, it was just like, oh, we're so glad we waited until the very last, like the 6th interview. And we picked her at the end of the day because we had already did one of the contracts for another one. I think Sharin was one of them that we were highly considering. There are 2 more. We were about to do it. And then we met Simone. We're like, whoa, she's so cool. We have to go with Simone. And I was really interested in placenta encapsulation, and she offered that as part of her services. She is an herbalist. She's vegan. There were just so many things that resonated with us. So yeah. And then with midwives, it was a little bit less straightforward because it was more like, okay, do they take insurance? A lot of them don't take insurance. Right. And it was really hard. Like probably looked up all of the ones you have on your resource page and even some independent ones. And I was even beginning to look into how the whole insurance process would work, like with reimbursement. But I decided it was too stressful to like work through that, especially because even though like technically the costs aren't going to be as large if you go with a midwife, it was just too much to think about, especially with the first pregnancy. And then we decided that at the end of the day, because it's the first pregnancy, we just would be more comfortable with being in a hospital. And I think I was also lucky because I had good close friends who had home births or like births that were very low intervention. So I think they say that you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with. That was really important for us and empowering for us instead of everyone around us having the regular hospital birth. So it was like very real for us that you can have a low intervention birth, that you're very, what's the word, like active in terms of decision making. And so
that's unusual really, friends you had.
Yeah.
To have more than
I
one.
feel very lucky. Yeah. One of my closest friends, her first birth was in a hospital and she literally fought to the death to not have an epidural. And the second birth she had was at home. And both very smooth. She's smaller than me and had 10-pound babies. And I'm pretty small.
That's encouraging.
So yeah, it was very encouraging. But yeah, so long story short, with the midwives, it ended up being like Metropolitan was easiest because we had a great tour there. They were very friendly. And there were a lot of like very empowering women of color as well that stood out to us. During the birth, it was a little bit, as you saw on my description, some things as a public hospital, they could do better.
Administrative, yes. Yeah.
But yeah, I think everyone we met, it was very, very smooth sailing. And then the biggest thing that happened was like week 37. It was like all of a sudden, everything was wrong. Everything was right. You're doing well, your baby's growing. And then they measured like what is it called? The fundal height.
Yep.
And I was 1 cm short. of it should be XCM equals X number of weeks. And yeah, it was like, oh my goodness, like there's 6 million things we need to do. Like at the end of the day, they still need to follow hospital protocol. Like they may say one thing, but they're like, I think even the midwife was like, I don't really think it's an issue. It's probably a constitutional thing. I mean, you've seen Samir and I, we're like pretty small people. We're probably not within the 10 percentile in the US. And so they were like, yeah, so we just need you to do a growth scan. And that was just the beginning of everything. Like work was really crazy for me because they needed me to do all this stuff before I left. It was the last month or so. And then scheduling. NYU, the great thing about NYU is that it's a factory, business factory, right? So everything's super efficient. Like any sonogram, like they get you in, they can change your scheduling, everything's online, it's super efficient. So I have to say that took a lot of stress out at the beginning, but it's like the complete opposite when it came to Metropolitan. Like we could not schedule anything if our lives depended on it, literally. And it was because the scheduler was on vacation and then was on jury duty. So there was just nobody doing any scheduling. And so
I think you compared it to the DMV when you wrote your birth story to me, right?
I mean, the DMV is a little bit better, but you know, the DMV 10 years ago when like you just stood in line and you never knew where you ended up. Yeah, it was like that. It was crazy. The first time we did a growth scan, we waited for 2 hours and they just forgotten about us because there was nobody at the front desk. And I literally had 3 meetings like in the waiting room on my laptop. And it just put a lot of stress on the last couple of weeks, I think. And then another midwife who I really liked, who ended up being at my birth, was very helpful. And she was like, look, these are the things that we have to do. There were 2 midwives I met at the end because they were like, you could still talk to a midwife before you make a decision. So we always opted to do that. And so they're like, the baby's measuring small based on this growth scan. That's a potential for FGR. Keyword there, potential, doesn't equal FGR. Based on gestational age, they would recommend inducing right away. I was like, wait, what? I'm about to go into another meeting. Or you can do increased monitoring, which was also stressful because I was like, I don't want to be coming in 3 times a week when I have all this work to do. But we opted for increased monitoring. So 2 to 3 times a week, we went in, we had to do another growth scan, and then we had to do the NST. I actually have to write this down. NSTBBB, the non-stress test, and the
biophysical profile.
Check your Doppler, because there was a few things you probably know better than I do. Now I'm like, it's like memory that I don't want to keep.
Sure.
It was like, they need to check if your placenta is working well, if the baby is still growing, and it's something about the size of the head versus the size of the body. There were just so many things that were like going over my head. And this was when Simone was also really key, because by then we had 2 prenatals with her. She was pretty clear about where our head was at. And she would be texting us like before and after, calling us and telling us like, okay, that's great. But there was one thing she said, which we hadn't thought about. She's like, well, then ask them what happens after. So you're induced, and then what? We're like, oh, we didn't even think of that. So we asked, and they're like, well, it depends on how big the baby is. If the baby is normal, then it was like, okay, so whether or not I induce doesn't necessarily make a difference in terms of like post-birth intervention or not. And so they also weren't able to schedule a next scan for us. So every week we were at a lesser percentile. And I realized it was because they were basing it off of the same scan, but time was passing, right? So it was like, well, he was 3 percentile last week, and then he's 5, 4, 3, 2. I was like, but you guys are using the same scan because we haven't been able to schedule another scan. So it was just like a whole mess.
Bizarre.
Yeah. And then the doctor couldn't see us. And then nobody could explain to us what was pointing or what factors were saying that there was a potential for this. So nobody can convince us, like in normal language. And I was just like, well, it's still just a potential. Like at the end of the day, this is recommended by the doctor. Why? Well, because of all these potential things. But my placenta is working fine. My Dopplers are great. The baby's moving. There's nothing else that is pointing to something that's not usual. So we just kept doing the monitoring, And Simone was like, let's just get this. What did she call it? Operation Natural Induction. She was like, let's do this. Let's eat this. Let's do that. Everything. I did everything. Curb walking, eat spicy food, whether or not it's evidence-based. I was like, whatever, I'll try it.
Yeah.
Eat this, eat that, like whatever needs to happen. And the other thing I wanted to mention that was really difficult, I'm actually reading through what I wrote to you, was at one point, one of my appointments, the midwives were attending a birth. And so I had to see an OB. Basically, she was like, you need to induce now or like tomorrow kind of thing. And if I choose not to, I had to sign an acknowledgement form. And in that conversation, she must have said like stillbirth like 5 times in terms of what the risks were. And like she herself said that she works in a high risk hospital in one of her rotations or whatever. So like she sees a lot. And so she's always seeing the worst case scenario, which, okay, cool. But that doesn't make me the worst case scenario automatically. Right. Like I think at some point, Samir was like, I think you're stressing her out way too much right now. So yeah, I had to sign this form where I took a picture of it to send to Simone. Like it listed in 4 lines, like all the potential things that could happen. And I'm still not consenting to induction. I mean,
this is an AMA, so an against medical advice form, it sounds like.
Probably, yeah. And then I went into labor the next day, like literally.
Yay!
Yeah, she actually came up to me afterwards
what a
to
relief.
say congrats.
Good.
But yeah, that was really hard because it was week 39 already. And like Simone was saying, the baby will come when the baby's ready. If you induce now, and a lot of your podcast and during your class, you said the same thing. Inducing when the baby's not ready means automatically pretty much more intervention. And I wasn't coming at it from like, I'm like anti-intervention for the sake of it. But I was like, if there's things that I can do naturally and there's no risk or very balanced or relatively little risk, then why not do it that way? And so I'm really glad I stuck to that. We both stuck to our guns and labor came naturally and relatively very little hiccups in terms of the process of it. So yeah, like going into the actual birth, I think I had pizza. I wrote that down. I was like, for some reason, really craving pizza. And I remember you were like, I wanted pepperoni pizza.
In my first labor, yep.
Yeah. And
I
was like,
for the win.
Yeah. I literally scoured the internet for gluten-free pizza in Astoria because Bellucci stopped making smaller pies. That was where we used to get it. But anyway, that's a side story. But yeah, I found gluten-free pizza. We ordered pizza. And the next morning it was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm in labor. And then Simone's like, wait, what? For real? Like literally everything worked that quickly. And then the app that you told us to download, she told us to keep sending us screenshots. As soon as that happened, Simone was like, okay, yeah, I'm going to come at around 2. She's like, okay, I'm coming right now. Because apparently it was happening faster than she had expected. And around 5-ish, I want to say. So I started laboring in bed around 7, and then around 5, 6, like early evening, we went into the hospital. That was not a fun ride. Like that moment of going into the Uber, I was like, now I understand why people do home births. Like traveling in labor, terrible.
Yes, agreed. So wait, how long was Simone with you before you left? She
probably arrived between noon and 1, and we labored at home. She was texting us throughout the process. We were joking afterwards that like her remedy for everything is take a walk, including postpartum. I was like, as she's not sleeping, she's like, take a walk. Like, I'm in labor, take a walk. I'm pushing, take a walk. I was like, someone needs to make a doula t-shirt that says take a walk. The doula's solution to everything. But yeah, we took a walk on a rooftop. I took a shower. By the time I was in the shower, she came. We did some positions on the couch. And then she was like, yeah, no, we have to go to the hospital like right now. And so I think we probably arrived. My timing is probably not the most accurate, but 5, 6, I think. They put us in this like little tiny examination room. And by then I was barely able to speak by the time I got to the hospital. And I was, I think, pretty much almost 2 minutes apart, I think, with close to 1 minute contractions. I was like 80% effaced, but only like 2 cm dilated. And I remember in your class, you were like, sometimes you might not want to know. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. But when I heard that, I was like, no.
You thought you were more dilated, I'm sure.
Yeah. And Simone was actually very surprised because she was like, she looks like she's about to give birth. And she had just gone to a birth where they had sent somebody home and she gave birth at home. And so she's like, and baby looks really low. We ended up finding out that I had a bulging sac. So it was like a lot of that. But yeah, she was like very nicely, calmly, but very, what's the word? Staunchly recommending that we are not sent home. And that midwife was kind of like, I don't know, I think you should go home. But now we know it was the end of her shift. So she was like, whatever with this, the next midwife can deal with this case. But she's like, yeah, we can make a plan. And then she just kind of walked away. So like this whole process of nobody really attending to us and like the shift change, now in hindsight's 2020, in retrospect, this did wonders for us, because Simone was like, in any other hospital, they would have been like timing you. They would have been like, you need to do this by this time. They just left us alone for a few hours. And they're like, yeah, as long as you wear a mask, you can walk the halls. And then there was just like nobody around for a while because there was the shift change. And so we walked the halls. Like I really had time to like relax, which like that's one of my lessons, like relaxing through the contractions. It sounds like an oxymoron even now. But yeah, that was what I had to do. Like, I just really had to open up. And as soon as they had a shift change, everything changed. It was like my favorite midwife, like the one that I had seen earlier, came in, and even Simone had known her. Samira was like, oh my gosh, I think she's so much happier now that she's seeing you, even though she's like going through a contraction right now. She was very like, okay, we're here. Because I guess the other midwife didn't read my chart. She's, well, you have this potential thing, so obviously we're not going to send you home. I don't even have to check you if you don't want me to. We're going to admit you, do your thing. We have laughing gas. Everything was like, yay, like blue skies again. Like the whole vibe changed, even though obviously I was still not happy in terms of going through the contractions, but it was much, much better. And I really could not imagine going home. So we had to wait, obviously, a few hours because they had to wipe down everything. That took a few hours for some reason. And so like Samir and Simone did their best in this tiny little room to create the atmosphere. Simone brought all these aromatherapy scents. I tried to eat something. I did not stop moving. Like I had so many different positions. We would walk up and down the hall. And then finally I got into the room, which was great. It was huge. It was like wireless monitoring. So I didn't have to be attached to these wires on the bed. And the bed moved as well. So I could like be on all fours. And the laughing gas was there, which is great. This is like the funniest part of the story now. And I was just like, all right, I can do this if I can get some kind of relief, because I still didn't have an epidural and I was still on the fence. From the beginning, I was like, I'm not going to not do the epidural for the sake of it. I'm going to see how I feel. Like I wanted that to be a flexible decision in my own head. There was a peanut ball. So everything was like going pretty well. And then labor really started to speed things up. And I was like, okay, if I don't get this nitrous oxide, I may need an epidural. And my water still hadn't broken, which was like in the back of my head was like worrying me a little bit, because I think that was part of the reason why the baby wasn't moving down faster. But I was like really in labor and feeling all of it. And they were squeezing like all the comfort positions, like everything on all the posters in your living room. We did that, I'm sure, because like I was just like every which way, all the different positions, because I couldn't keep still. That was when I realized like I can't get an epidural. Like the point when I realized it sounds more painful for me to stay still for 20 minutes, keep on these contractions. And I was like, oh my goodness, my life is going to end. But that's like the better of the two evils. And so, yeah, finally, in just a very short while of time, I was like 6 centimeters dilated and fully effaced. And they're like, just keep doing what you're doing. I hated hearing that at the time, because I was already saying to Simone, like, look, I don't think I can do this anymore. She's like, you're doing it. You're doing it. Just keep doing it. I'm like, can. And then meanwhile, there's this whole thing going on about the laughing gas, right? They're like, we can't find the tubes. Like the manager's looking for it, but the manager's out. It's the weekend. Every time they came back, there was a new thing. Oh, they're looking in the storage. They're looking in the basement. They're reporting back. And it was literally like in my face. It was like this close to me, because I was like on the bed,
foot away from you.
Huge canister of gas. And I was laboring with my face like right there. And I was like, I'm never going to get this. But yeah, now it's funny, but then it was not funny. But yeah, and like I said, I didn't get an epidural, so I really ended up doing everything naturally, which was not my intention. But I think at the end, it was a good thing in terms of my recovery. But
Did you mention what you were listening to?
Oh, yeah. We were looping the same song.
Oh, one
which
song?
is now Eshe's favorite, like, birth song, we call it. It's called Breathable Moment, I think. I always get the name wrong. But I can send it to you, yeah. Because I was just like, I need something that's relaxing.
Yes.
And then every time they switch to the next song, I was like, no, same song. And so they just looped the whole song. And there was this one scent that I kept asking for. It's called Adaptive, I think. And it's a mix of something that's like uplifting and relaxing at the same time. So she said she didn't want me to relax too much and slow things down because this was the time things needed to happen. But at the same time, she didn't want me to be too tense. So that mix was like perfect for me. So the sound and the smell was really important. And of course, Simone and Samir being there the whole time. And we had a great nurse who was actually a former doula training to be a midwife. And crazy side story, Samir used to be her boss, like at a prior job.
No way.
Yeah, they both used to work in retail and he was her manager. It was like one of the craziest things. And then her and Simone knew each other through Instagram because of doulas following each other. So it was like a very nice atmosphere in hindsight. But I mean, for me at that point, I was just like, whatever. But now it was a really good atmosphere to be in and to labor in. And so at some point, things slowed down, which was a really good relief for me because I was like really too intense for a while. But then I was like, wait, I don't want things to move down either. And I think there were 9 babies born that day. So the midwives were really busy. And so there's no one around except Simone and the nurse. And so they did some baby mapping. And like, I think I wrote like most of my labor was back labor. I remember you saying that you had that too. That was part of what was making it so terrible. And they were like, I think baby is sunny side up. That's what's going on.
What
and
it
that's
sounded
why it's slowing down. Yeah.
With such a frequency and an intensity when you're just 2 centimeters dilated. I mean, the forewaters also could, if that's in front of the baby, that also makes it harder to dilate the cervix as efficiently. But yeah, that's not surprising at all.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's because I wasn't in an epidural, but I couldn't even process anything. It was just like one feeling constantly. And at one point they thought I was pushing because I had like contractions that were like 7-8 minutes and it was just so much. And then when things slowed down, they're like, well, baby can't move down. And so they needed me to be in a sideline position. So as painful as it was at that point, I needed something to happen. So they called it an exaggerated lunge on a peanut ball. So I spent a long time doing that to turn baby. So both the nurse and Simone helped me do that on one side and the other to make space for baby to turn. And I guess it worked because baby turned and all of a sudden it was like a light switch. I was definitely pushing. Like I couldn't process any of these changes. It was just like, it was obvious for everyone involved. It was like a whole new peak. I think it's called transition. It was just like, yeah, everything's changed all of a sudden. And then I was just like, this can't happen for much longer. I'm like, it's too intense. And my water still hadn't broken. And so I was like, okay, I asked Simone, can you ask them to break my water? Because I can't do this anymore. If it's going to make it faster, I want everything to happen faster. And everyone was filing in at this point. The lights were on because they're like, she's pushing. And then my water broke, actually, which is great. I was like,
just
oh
like going into labor before the induction.
Yeah, I know. And then when that happened, I could feel like a relief and baby moved down much faster. And I think at the end, not all of it had broken, actually. Like right before the baby came out, they had to break it again for me because there was a bit left. But yeah, I pushed for 29 minutes. I mean, it felt like 29 hours for me, but the midwives later told me that I probably didn't need to push for that long, but the reason was because of the sac. I had a full bladder. I remember in your class, you said remember to pee, but I couldn't because of the sac. I had a very full bladder, and because of the sac, that's why it took us long, because they're like, your baby's like pretty small. Like you could have probably pushed for a lot less time if those 2 things weren't in the way. I was like basically pushing 2 other things along with the baby. I had pushed on hands and knees for most of it. And then they turned me on my side at the very end. One person was like holding my leg. One of the midwives was holding my leg out. And it was just like, you just need to get the baby out right now. They were just letting me do my thing for the longest time. But the last 2 minutes, they're like, you need to like hold your breath and because the baby needs to come out now. And then everything happened very quickly after that. But yeah, that was like relatively smooth. Like I was conscious the whole time. It was very, now I can say very empowering in terms of, wow, like my body did all that by itself. I had no idea that was going to be how it happened. And it was just such a relief. Like the whole process was such a relief. And we were able to do skin to skin. Samir was able to cut the cord. We were able to delay it. We weren't able to delay as much as we probably would have liked. But because of the potential FGR, there was this whole thing about we need to weigh the baby. We need to weigh the baby. We need to weigh the baby. But they were very respectful of my birth preferences. It was really funny. Like when I was pushing and I was like in hell, they were just very calmly, the midwives was like handing out my birth preferences. Oh, she wants this. She doesn't want this. I was like, baby's not even out yet. Can you just focus on me? But they were like, okay, yeah, vitamin K, like very administrative about it. But yeah, but they were very respectful of that. So I appreciated it. But the pediatrician and his team, his little posse was just like lingering.
I love that you call
and
it
that's
posse.
like a whole other like army and protocol that's like the midwives can't touch. Midwives are great in taking care of me, taking care of the baby, and our preferences right afterwards, delaying as much as we could the cord clamping, despite what the pediatricians were hovering by, trying to get us to weigh the baby, letting us have the skin to skin time. But at some point, the midwives were like, okay, the pediatrician has to talk to you now. And so I was still like in the shock when you're like shaking. And the pediatrician was like, okay, like we need to weigh the baby. If the baby's this many pounds, then this has to happen. If the baby's this many pounds, this has to happen. I didn't really process any of what he said, but I just knew that they need to weigh the baby. I was like, okay, go weigh the baby. And I just remember that, okay, make sure Samir is there when they're weighing the baby. And of course, the baby was like almost 6 pounds. And so no NICU, no nothing. So the next concern was blood sugar. I know.
Okay.
Even though they were saying he was going to be 4 pounds. The next thing was like blood sugar. And so that was the start of the whole breastfeeding formula shenanigans. That's like its own story, I guess. But I think that for the birth part, like that was beautiful. Up until that point, like everything happened in a very good way at the end of the day. Yes, all of this administrative stuff was terrible, but at the end, now that I think about it, it worked in my favor. I like did it myself, you know. Oh, and I also ended up not needing stitches or anything. I was convinced that I had tore. I was like, how many degree tears did I have? Because it felt like it was crazy. And then the midwife was like, oh, you might need one stitch. Oh, but it stopped. You're good. I was like, wait, what? That's not how it feels. I feel like I need 10. But yeah, it meant that I had a very smooth, relatively smooth recovery. I remember in your last podcast, Dr. Sharma was like, keep those things in your Amazon cart. That's what I did.
Yes.
I had a lot of those things, but I didn't buy them. I was like, oh, I shouldn't mess myself up. Just thinking that I'm going to have like 4th degree tears when maybe I won't. I didn't. So
yay.
I did make like padsicles and I used those. But other than that, it was like relatively not as bad as I had psyched myself up to. I was really prepared for a lot of pain during recovery. But yeah, so I think that was great. But then I think what started being difficult was just the postpartum stage. There was a lot of pressure in terms of blood sugar. So his blood sugar was not off the charts. I think it was like between X and Y is normal, X being the low, Y being the high. And he was like 1 or 2, whatever units above the low end. So now that I think about it, it's like, well, he's technically in range, but they were like, it's low. So if breastfeeding doesn't happen now.
But it's not. It's in the normal
breastfeeding
range.
needs to happen now. We're going to come back in 15 minutes and we're going to measure him again because he's still small. Even though he's not NICU small, he's still small. Then we're giving you formula. So the thing that I'm still happy about is like the battle we did win was we brought our own formula. And like the nurse there was really good about it. They're like, well, do you have water? And the nurse was like, we got you. Like, I'll get you water, like the laboring nurse. So we were able to feed him our own formula, not like whatever the hospital was going to give us. So that was a little bit of a win. But, you know, obviously with that kind of pressure. And like even with Simone there, like the latch didn't happen right away. I had harvested colostrum. That was another thing we got from your website. So he did have some colostrum, but it was not enough to raise his blood sugar to whatever level that they needed it to be 15 minutes or whatever time frame it was after. And then every 4 hours for the next 48 hours, they were monitoring his blood sugar. And the poor thing, like his tiny little feet were like purple from all the pokes. And that was part of the reason why we decided not to circumcise, because I just gave Samir the ability to decide on that. I was like, I would prefer not to, but you know, if it's important to you, you can make the call at that point. He was like, no way. Because there were so many needles involved right after he was born.
He's been poked enough. Yeah.
Yeah. It was like a lot of very intense monitoring. And we had a nurse who was like from the NICU. So her mindset was like, he's going to be hypoglycemic. He's going to be hypoglycemic. And that affects brain development and blah, blah, blah. And it like put so much pressure on us. We were like feeding him like obsessively, making formula. And Samir went and bought a kettle like at the nearest Target just so that we could continue to make our own formula. And it was because they kept wanting to give us formula as well. Even then, because we had transferred to the postpartum unit by then, and our nurse wasn't there to help us through that. And so that was the beginning of our feeding journey. It was just like, you got to feed. And at some point, we got really upset that it looked like they were trying to force feed him. And then long story short, the head pediatrician came to apologize and explain to us like why, which was helpful. They were just like, we're just really concerned that he's small. And so we really want to make sure that the hypoglycemia doesn't happen. We don't want to force feed him. They gave us a little bit more explanation, which helped. But it was a lot of pressure and we wanted out of there. And so when they cleared him in terms of the first 48 hours of blood sugar monitoring, his blood sugar was like off the chart. Well, not off the charts, but way within the range. I was fine. So I was like, can we leave? Is there any reason why we have to stay? And they were like, no. So they allowed us to have an early checkout. So we left like basically 2 nights after birth. And it was so nice to be home again. And Simone saw us right away. But then I guess because the feeding was still, there was a lot of pressure on that. I met with Kara, the lactation consultant, and then later Annie as well. But the main concern was like, make sure he gets enough. And because the latching wasn't happening, it was a big challenge. And they were trying to figure out, because between the inverted nipple and with him, Kara and Annie were trying to figure out what's going on. And then when I saw Annie for the first time, she was like, oh, I think I can't tell you this, but he has a lip and tongue tie. And then we're like, oh, what's that? I'm sure I had read about it somewhere, somehow, but it was not in our radar. And then when she explained that to us, we got the procedure done pretty quickly. I had friends who had that done. I think the doctor is also listed on your resources page. He was really good, really fast. And I wouldn't say it changed breastfeeding really. Like Annie was helpful to help in showing me that it was possible. Like he did latch like a handful of times. And the next issue though was that I wasn't making enough milk. So I'm sure I read about it at some point, but supply problems, that was like a whole other thing for me, because before I had Eshe, I was like, it's all or nothing, right? You breastfeed or you don't breastfeed. I didn't know that there was this in between of, oh, I could pump and give him breast milk. I was like, oh, that's amazing. Let me do that. And so I became obsessive about my supply, basically, and trying to get my supply up. But I was really not producing nearly enough. And that was really frustrating. And I think Annie was really helpful for being very non-judgmental and trying to help me increase supply in any way possible. At the same time, helping Eshe recover from the lip and tongue tie. Because at some point before and after the procedure, he couldn't suck. Annie spent a long time figuring out like what was going on, because feeding was an issue, not just because he couldn't breastfeed like on my breast, but because he wasn't doing it efficiently on the bottles. Like newborns are tired all the time anyway, and so they fall asleep all the time. So that part was normal. And Annie was the one that was able to see it. He wasn't sucking on the bottle. He was like clamping down, swallowing, and that was more tiring. So he wasn't getting enough. And he was getting even more tired than newborn
right. They
tired.
wear themselves out. Yeah. Working too hard.
So that was like the next main priority. I couldn't even think about breastfeeding. It was like, okay, let's make sure he can feed even on a bottle, because we need to make sure he feeds in the first couple of days. So that was a whole process. And then Dr. Vela was great as well because we then started doing some body work to relax him. And then Annie gave us some exercises. And slowly, I think it took at least a month or so. And we had to go through 3 different types of bottles. And it was actually a trainer bottle that has this long part, but it was a trainer bottle that at the end of the day got everything working again. Or not again, but he relearned how to use everything. And that one bottle, which was like $30, but it was the best $30 we've ever spent, retrained him to suck. That was when we could finally breathe again. He was like able to efficiently feed from bottle. He gained weight really quickly. Our pediatrician was like so happy. He was like, do whatever you need to do. You're good. He's good. Like he's gaining weight, whatever makes you feel happy or makes it whole for you. You have plenty of bandwidth because he's gaining weight. So that was at least a good month and a half. But yeah, I never ended up making enough milk, which I think now I'm slowly realizing that I need to be a little bit less obsessive over that. And I'm rereading some of the books that I read before and realizing that another thing I couldn't prepare for is that logic goes out the window sometimes when you're postpartum, like how much the emotional drive takes over. And it was so obvious for me when I was pregnant and reading this book. Like, for example, I'm rereading Crib Sheet by Emily Oster, and she has very great data-driven information about breastfeeding. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. I don't need to obsess over it if it doesn't work. But when I was like in it, I've been so obsessed, still am a little bit, I would say, obsessive over it. That was the hardest part. I think I've been getting in the way of getting through all this more than anything. Especially because the feeding is such a big thing. And then because I was so obsessively pumping all the time, like every 2 hours, not getting enough sleep, I wasn't able to participate in the feeding relationship because Samir would help as much as possible and bottle feed while I was just like obsessively pumping and trying to get more milk and taking all supplements. So yeah, I think that's been the most difficult part for me.
Yeah, time
Thank
and
you
time
for
again.
listening. That was a lot more than I was thinking about.
It's great, Bettina.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're sharing all of this. The thing I hear all the time from new parents is just, that deep emotional investment that surprises us at how deep it runs and the pressure that we put on ourselves and how challenging that can be, deeply challenging, and how it can often hit our mental health in surprising ways. So I'm always glad for people to share that. Thank you. I wanted to ask you with regard to the formula, what was it that made you decide you wanted to bring your own formula to the hospital? And was it a specific kind that you just, for your family, you preferred over something that the hospital might provide?
Yeah, we wanted to have European formula. And I mean, I had done some research and it just felt more comfortable to know about the ingredients and where things came from and what organic meant. And also a friend of mine highly recommended HIP. We ended up it's a German formula. We just wanted to know what it was, and we had no idea what the hospital was going to give us.
Sure.
And so, we made sure we brought the formula and the colostrum to the hospital.
I do wish that HIP and Holly had a liquid version, just because normally for newborns, it's recommended to do liquid. It's just because it's sterile and the powder isn't. And then with the formula, did you use a regular bottle with an artificial nipple or a syringe or a cup or a spoon?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. We started with a syringe. So we actually syringe fed him for most of basically the first 2 weeks. And so I think that was recommended by the lactation consultant.
Probably.
I think Kara. Like, keep it on the syringe. And also Simone at the very beginning, they were like, let's use it. They gave us a syringe actually in the labor room to feed. And he was really good at taking from the syringe, just like squeezing it at the edge of his mouth. So we syringe fed him for a good 2 weeks or so until he was taking so much that even the bigger syringes, it was like too bulky.
Enough.
And that's when we started the bottle. And that's when the whole bottle sucking thing became an issue as well.
Okay. Thanks for elaborating on those things. And I was wondering if you might be willing to share a little bit about the bodywork sessions with Dr. Vela, the chiropractor.
He's like some kind of magician, I think.
I know. That's what everybody always says.
We don't know what happened.
Right. It's such gentle techniques, right?
No, I think what Annie had said was that part of it could be, they both affect each other, right? She was saying that the tension causing lip and tongue tie effects. That was before we figured out he had one. That was like making him too tense, or it could be the other way around. The lip and tongue tie was causing the tension. Mm-hmm. And so she said, either reason, whatever it is, it's good to help him release that tension, either through craniosacral therapy, some kind of body work, basically, she said. And she gave me a bunch of links. And I did the same thing. I think I said proximity and potential for insurance. But proximity was the most important because he was so young. And we went into the city for the procedure, and that was like, oh man, we don't want to do this again. Especially because we knew it would be like not just one session, probably more than one session. So we wanted someone close and local. And I still remember the first time after we went, he was so small, he barely fit on one knee. We have like pictures of Dr. Villa and Eshe, and he was like so tiny in the beginning. And now he fits on his lap. But he was just like, we don't know what he did. But after the first session, he went from like always being like, if you picked Eshe up, he would be like fetal position, like constantly really tight. We didn't realize he was really tight until after that, actually.
Yeah.
It's always really, really tight. He just like relaxed, like he would flop when we picked him up, which had never happened. Wow. And he slept, I think, the very first time. After that, too many other factors were going into sleep. But the very first time, it was like we could see a marked difference. But overall, it was mainly just decreasing tension and having him like flop around more in his body. Those were the main things that really helped.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. Thank you. I just saw Dr. Vella a couple of days just for my regular personal monthly maintenance. And he was talking to me about the fascia and this layer across our whole body, and how a lot of the pediatric work that's done with a craniosacral therapist or a chiropractor is almost always very gentle. And they're often dealing with the fascia because it can get a little twisted and a little tight in the birthing process. And just these gentle adjustments can be so powerfully effective, like magic, as you said, in really just releasing a lot of tension, including in the oral restriction in the area of the mouth. So that's really cool to hear. I was skeptical when I first started going to him personally. I hadn't grown up with chiropractic normalized really, but once I started going, I was just like, he is a magician. It's amazing. It really is very powerful and very effective. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that was helpful for Eshe. Well, what else did you want to share? Was there anything else that you wanted to share before we start to wrap things up?
No, I think those are the main things, unless there's anything else you want me to elaborate on.
Well, one thing you shared with me was at the end of class, I share this mythic story of Inanna from the wonderful book Transformed by Birth by Dr. Britta Bushnell. And you had referred to it when you looped back around and shared your birth story with me. And if I may, I would love to just read a little bit of the very beginning of what you wrote me. Would that be okay? And you can just let me know if you want me to edit it out.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I forgot about that. I'm glad you mentioned it.
I loved the whole first paragraph that you wrote. I'm not the go with the flow kind of person. Ironic, because that's part of the meaning of Eshe's Chinese name. I like to optimize all variables that I can control, do all the research, and have a plan before I start anything. This whole journey that started with the idea of family has shown me that sometimes you just have to trust the process and go with the flow, and that fluidity and agility are also a form of strength. I see clearly now how the story of Inanna provides a beautiful metaphor to the journey of conception, birth, and family. My favorite part of that was fluidity and agility are also a form of strength. You have a way with words. And it's so true.
Yeah, I remember now thinking back to your story. And I don't know if you remember, there was a whole thing, I lost it. Like I lost the scroll and I had you send it to me in PDF. I'm so glad you did. And then of course I found it afterwards. But I think the thing that made the connection for me is vulnerability. It's like the metaphor about the layers or all of her different things being cast away. It's like you're just so vulnerable. Like you're so raw in the moment. And that's really what it was that connected it for me, with Ananda, like losing this and losing that.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I would re-emphasize again is just like the people around you. Just create your experience. I mean, obviously, you yourself, that's where it starts, right? I think that's where I didn't really talk too much about it, but the hypnobirthing thing really helped me realize it's just like you're really in it inside of yourself, especially. I mean, I can't speak for how it feels like for other people. For me, it was very so introspectively intense. Like you're just there with the feeling. Like I don't even want to use the word pain because I don't think that even fully describes like how it feels, but like the whole kind of intense process, you're just so in yourself and so vulnerable that the people immediately around you throughout that time, not just the actual birth and the labor, but afterwards, that vulnerability remains. And you have to be really open to being okay with it and opening up for people to help you through that. And it's really just about the people, like having people that you trust and that resonate well with you has been really important. Having you, your class, that was a really good kind of beginning of creating, like getting that sense of community. And then having Simone and then all the other people who have just helped along the way. Like I said, Annie, Kara, Dr. Vella, they've all been so important in helping me through it. Like it's still hard. At the end of the day, it's still you, yourself, and you, like dealing with everything. But it's really good to have that help.
Absolutely. Yeah. It would be a lot harder without that community of support. Well, thank you so much, Bettina. I really appreciate your willingness to share your beautiful journey.
Thanks, Lisa.
After we recorded, Bettina wrote me and shared a few extra things that she wanted to add, so I wanted to share that with you. She shared the following. I just remembered that I had promised to also give you Eshe's birth song. You had asked me about my environment, which was so key during the birth process. My 5 senses were definitely taken care of. This is the song on the playlist that I just wanted on loop, and Eshe ended up being born while it was playing. Breathable moment. The lights were dim. Simone had essential oils ready. This relaxing and grounding scent called Adaptive. Both were taking turns, squeezing, holding my hips through all the back labor. I wasn't tasting much by the end of it, but they did let me snack. I also just thought of a crucial detail from my taste sense. Simone had prepared a post-delivery tea for me to sip on within an hour of delivery. She offered some to Samir, but he was not into it, LOL. And it was the most nourishing thing I felt for a long time. It was some kind of warm ginger-based magic that made me feel so soothed inside. That's all she wrote. And I will be sure to link to both Breathable Moment on Spotify, as well as a link to that essential oil blend, which is doTERRA brand Adaptive. Just in case you wondered what that rhythmic sound was toward the end, if you're already a pumping parent, you know. But if you're not, you might not know that that's the sound of a breast pump. You gotta pump when you gotta pump. Just wanted to clarify that FGR is fetal growth restriction. It's also known as IUGR, or intrauterine growth restriction. Both refer to concerns about the baby not thriving in utero or measuring small. When there's concern about FGR or IUGR, usually your provider will want to do a BPP or biophysical profile, which Bettina also mentioned. This is a more comprehensive assessment of whether or not baby is thriving in utero. I go through the details of this test in the end notes of episode 51, so you can listen to episode 51 to learn more about this. Did you have questions about anything you heard in today's or other episodes? Let us know, and that will help us know what things to share more about. Or are there kinds of birth stories you haven't heard yet that you're interested in hearing? Let us know. Email us anytime at podcast@birthmattersnyc.com. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, here's a sneak peek of what's up next time.
I was still just relying on vocalizing to manage the intensity. The nurse was with me and she used this phrase that I don't remember now, but I wrote it down. And the phrase was, let the pain melt. And she just kept saying it over and over. And something about that worked for me. She would just say it as the contraction was building, let the pain melt. I would just focus on it's going to melt away. Just ride it out, because it always does. It always goes away. And then you're back to zero, even if just for a minute.
Something to ponder this week for those of you who are expecting a baby. Are there songs or nourishing foods or drinks you could have on hand for your birthing day? Bettina mentioned a tea her doula provided made her feel soothed inside. What could help you feel soothed inside when your body is working hard to birth your little one? This could be music or something you eat or drink, or anything really. Explore all your senses and think strategically about this. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with a friend. Be sure to subscribe or follow if you're not already, wherever you're listening. Leave us a review and even sign up for our email list if you haven't. You can do that over at birthmattersshow.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Birth Matters podcast. Be well, and we'll see you next time.